Yeah, thank you. Does this work? Thank you so much for this extreme. Does it work? Thank you so much for this, for the invitation to this amazing event. I've actually never seen an event where philosophy goes public the way it does here in Modena. So this is an amazing experience. And thank you so much for this most welcoming and knowledgeable introduction. Again, this is the kind of introduction that one wants to have in order to make oneself understand. Today I will be talking about pathologies of work, and as Signora Caridi has mentioned, I've been working on alienation quite a lot. So this talk is about pathologies of work, which obviously has something to do with the broader topic of alienation, but I try here to track what kind of symptoms we can experience with our everyday work experiences in contemporary capitalist society. So my paper proposes to consider what I call pathologies of work in the context of a historico-normative reconstruction of the meaning of work as social cooperation. In adopting this diagnostic approach, I have two aims. On the one hand, my consideration of aberrant societal developments as pathologies of work intends to illuminate, through an analysis of negative phenomena, the positive content of the worth and meaning of work in modern societies. On the other hand, I wish to bring together under one roof a number of different problems. These include the continued existence of exploitation and alienation, the precariousness of work and long-term structural unemployment, and the threat posed to contemporary working conditions by what one could call the de-dignifying of work, to invert a notion of Robert Castel. The title of this paper, Pathologies of Work, is intended to indicate and establish a connection between these different problems by conceiving them as different kinds of deficits in a labor-mediated form of social cooperation. Borrowing a phrase from Hegel, we can say that work amounts to sharing, participating, or partaking in the universal resources of society. I understand the word resources here to mean that which a given society has achieved and that which it is further capable of in terms of wealth as well as competencies. Work thus allows us to share in the resources of society not simply insofar as it constitutes a means of acquiring wealth or entry into the sphere of intersubjective relations, but also insofar as it enables one to share in the evaluating knowledge and know-how of a society. If this is what work means, then the above-mentioned pathologies of work can be understood as different ways of refusing or preventing participation in these universal resources. It would, of course, be superfluous to note that work is a highly social, politically charged topic. In order to see that, one only has to take a quick glance at the news. But from a more long-term perspective as well, it would be difficult for anyone to remain oblivious to the urgency of the problems that we might group under the umbrella term of the crisis of the work-oriented society. Nevertheless, in recent decades, there seems to have been a narrowing of the social-political treatment of the question of work. At the tail end of the '68 movement and in the labor union debates of the '70s, the question of the humanization of work was very widely discussed, particularly with a view to the forms of alienation with which work, and especially industrial labor, is bound up. For most people today, however, the scarcity of work, underpayment, and the precarization of working conditions, which in certain respects undermines the historical compromise solution of a legally dignified labor market that is held in check by the welfare state, have taken center stage in political debates. Questions concerning the quality of work and the demand for meaningful, good or non-alienated work seems to have been put on ice, as it were, for less trying times. In my view, however, this change in the conversation around work does not correspond to the subjective experience of those who do or do not work. Beyond the mere facts of insecurity and insufficient remuneration, even those working in the most casual and worst paid jobs also undergo painful experiences that one would be quite justified in calling experiences of alienation. This is because in our work-oriented society, work plays a preeminent role. We do not only maintain a livelihood through our gainful employment. As Hegel writes, not only the individual's subsistence, but also her worth and dignity are mediated by work. Work structures our lives, our self-consciousness, our sense of self, and our social relations. A great deal of what we do, and not only if we are workaholics, is directly or indirectly connected to the role that we occupy or wish to occupy in the social sphere of work. Likewise, the perceived success of our lives and our social relationships depends to a great extent not just on whether we have work, but also on what kind of work this is. What does it tell us then when employees at Berlin's National Library complain of their contemptuous treatment by both library users and their superiors, and of a decreasing sense of responsibility resulting from the greater use of contracted labor, a situation also reflected in the increasing casualization and outsourcing of labor in hospitals? When teachers complain that they do not have time to meet the ever more diverse demands of their jobs, and when the pressure of contemporary academic life make professors feel as though they are stuck on a hamster wheel, which is a direct quote from a colleague of mine. It tells us that individuals have complex and rich expectations regarding their working conditions, and that these expectations can be disappointed. What is especially interesting here, however, is that when faced with such inappropriate working conditions, people not only feel insulted as a person, but also feel disdained in their work and as workers. Unlike the sociologist Heinz Bude, who claims that many so-called low-skilled jobs involve work that one cannot do well and that one thus could not possibly identify with, it seems to me that one can observe, to borrow a familiar motive, a desperate desire for identification, even under the most unlikely of circumstances. Even in what may seem at first glance to be the most nondescript jobs, people still seek out and sometimes find a certain scope for appropriation and self-determination. This scope for making one's work one's own is established, made use of, and vehemently defended not only in supposedly creative or explicitly social professions, but also in other areas and at the other end of the pay scale. This is not to say that meaningful work only depends on us and our ability to identify with or to appropriate it. To the contrary. But to the extent that this is the case, it explains why it is possible for individuals to be heard when their need to identify with their work is blocked. And it is precisely because we expect to find meaning in our work and attempt to carve out a non-alienating space within objectively alienating working conditions that we are vulnerable to exploitation, or at least this contributes to our vulnerability. Work is thus clearly enmeshed in a dense network of ethical relations, normative expectations, and normatively charged functional conditions which may or may not be fulfilled. In other words, what is important is not simply work as such, but the quality and standing of one's work. Or in more traditional terms, what is important is not simply labor without exploitation, but labor without alienation. To indicate the phenomena that interest me in connection with the social conditions of work, and to give a sense of the diversity of the scenarios that a philosophical diagnosis and critique of contemporary working conditions must address, I would like to begin by sketching some of today's paradigmatic pathological working conditions. Let us begin with labor conditions in the service sector and with what have been described in sociological terms as roles performed by a newer old service sector proletariat. These roles typically consist of unskilled services, a lot of them performed by women, such as cleaning, building, maintenance, cloakroom services, front desk and cashier duties, and so on. Most of the services in question are now performed by agency workers. They are systematically outsourced. The problems now accompanying these developments are well known. They include not only the lower remuneration that such workers often receive in comparison with permanent members of staff, but above all, the increased precarization of their work, the negligible legal protection they are offered, and the loss of the accomplishments tied to the dignifying of work that Castell remarked upon. These working conditions are characterized by systematic underpayment, systematic understaffing, and poor timetabling, sometimes due to long commutes not even allowing for a good night's sleep. This not only makes one think of the overexploitation known from earlier times of capitalism, there is also a further respect in which these conditions are instances of what I have termed pathologies of work. Deregulation often goes hand in hand with the monotonization and impoverishment of tasks, and thus of the skills required to perform them. These working conditions cause suffering because they make it increasingly difficult for workers to identify with their work. Thus, this sector in particular has seen developments that have drastically changed the subjective experience of the quality of such work and individuals' relation to it, as well as the relation between such workers and their immediate superiors. Whereas in the past, without wishing to romanticize, the school janitor was a member of the school staff and was feared, annoyed, and respected in equal measure, today he is often an employee of a private security company on a temporary contract with carefully measured working hours. This doesn't only lead to a loss of social standing. We also have to consider the frustration that goes along with the impossibility of doing one's work well. Consider, for example, nurses who don't find enough time to care for their patients under the strict regimen of a marketized hospital system. Nurses complain about working conditions that are not only precarious and potentially exploitative, but also frustrating. And there's yet another dimension. Bad working conditions related to outsourcing and precariousness then are obstacles to fulfilling what the workers have taken on as some kind of work ethics related to the tasks to be performed. Or to put it simply, these conditions make work as work bad. Artists, journalists, writers, and other freelancers also tend to be in precarious positions. The members of this professional group can even be regarded as pioneers in precariousness, insofar as the latter goes hand in hand with what Ulrich Bröckling has called the entrepreneurialism of the self. This form of self-cultivation, marked by an identification with the project one works on, was initially associated with the bohemian conception of freedom and creativity. Yet those who celebrated such precarious project-based work years ago as an alternative to normal working conditions and restrictive 9-to-5 jobs are increasingly coming to see the flip side of such doubly free work, to use Marx's expression. Here too, the problem is not limited to the hardships attendant on the precariousness of such workers, which may manifest themselves very differently in the different segments of this part of the labor market. In addition, the permanent pressure to cultivate and interpret oneself on the basis of criteria of employability promotes an instrumental relation to oneself and one's occupation, which then becomes a pathology of an alienating kind again. Likewise, the pressure to take responsibility for oneself and for the continual threat of failure tends to reduce solidarity. For the artist, precarious work is only ever a transitional phase, whatever kind of job she may do to pursue her brilliant intuitions, and in any such transitional phase, it is difficult to build alliances. This leads to a situation that is desired by no one and yet jointly produced by everyone, a phenomenon that one could call a collective incapacity to act. If this new kind of work has been interpreted as the abolition of alienation, it now turns out that this seems to be instead a somehow paradoxical development in which the end of one type of alienation, the classical one related to monotony and fragmentation, is followed by the introduction of another kind. Let me finally mention a pathology of work which is in fact not a pathology of work at all, but of non-work, namely unemployment, which represents the long-term loss of the possibility of sharing in the work-oriented society. In a work-oriented society in which individuals are integrated into legally protected jobs, the unemployed are superfluous. They are those who have no use for their time. Their experience is like that of the participants in Marie Jaroda, Lars Sarsfeld and Hans Zeisel's groundbreaking study on the unemployed residents of Marienthal in the in the 20s of the last century. At some day, I quote, midday comes, says one of their participants, after being asked to describe his daily routine. A routine marked by a continually expanding time of waiting, resignation, devaluation, and apathy. Now, even a brief glance at the contemporary pathologies of work I have sketched above, without any claim to completeness, shows us that we are dealing with a rather complicated picture. We are confronted with a divided labor market that presents very different problems depending on one's position within it. Too much work on the one hand, too little on the other, too much identification and expectation of, or even compulsion toward identification on the one hand, too few opportunities for identification on the other. What we see then are very classical phenomena of the devaluation and downskilling of work due to working conditions that make workers interchangeable with respect to their skills and personalities. Alternatively, we are confronted with a universally flexible worker whose free time is turned into work time and whose creative potential can only be developed at the cost of investing her whole personality in it. Whereas in classical industrial work, it was a certain inflexibility in the Fordist division of labor that led to the fragmentation of tasks and the suffering of employees. Today's employees suffer on account of the shifting skill sets demanded by their work and the corresponding vagueness over whatever they meet these requirements. Here, the idea of the whole person and the realization of their potential itself becomes a problem. But they are not simply two kinds of problems. We have seen that under the working conditions sketched above, different pathologies come together in different ways. There's typically a mixture of precariousness, deprivation, material deficiency, and social exclusion, though not all of these factors have to appear together. There is also, for example, a precarious but not materially poor middle class, or a middle class that is precarious and relatively poor, but not necessarily excluded from that label. And the vulnerability caused by casualization and the threat of long-term joblessness, of course, opens the door to exploitation, but it also goes hand in hand with the painful downskilling and impoverishment of work and the instrumentalization and self-instrumentalization of the worker. Thus, when front desk services at the National Library lose their institutional anchoring within the library, an employee's area of expertise, and thus the diversity of their work and the authority they acquire through it come to be circumscribed, this may be directly linked to the fact that work has been subcontracted through a drive to economize, so that some shifts are now taken on by employees of outside agencies. What the front desk staff complains about is that there is, I quote, nothing for us to do here anymore. In other words, it's no longer possible for them to act in a way that they feel is important. What keeps them up at night and causes them to develop psychosomatic symptoms is that the relations they have developed with library users over many years and the authority that they have thereby gained risks being lost. And when the cleaning company employee complains that due to the limited hours they are given per week, they cannot even remove the worst dust in the school classrooms, they also indicate that their expectations concerning the meaning and the objective rather than subjective quality of the work they do and their possibility of identifying with it have been disappointed. What this reveals, however, is not only that alienation still exists and is linked in various ways to other problems, but also that the classical diagnosis of alienation, the paradigmatic diagnosis of a social pathology of work, does not take us much further by itself. Though I have suggested that many of the pathologies discussed above can indeed be regarded as experiences of alienation, one nonetheless has to conceive alienation here in a broader and different manner to those who, like Marx's contemporaries, though not Marx himself, oriented themselves exclusively by Adam Smith's example of the division of labor in the pin factory, or by the fear dominant in Goethe's time of the loss of the whole person. There are then, at the phenomenal level, new forms of alienation that call for new interpretations. These new interpretations also serve to show that the old interpretations were, even in their own time, unsatisfactory. insofar as they rested on romantic essentialist definitions of the human being and its activities. We are now getting closer to what the concept of pathologies of work refers to. By pathologies of work, I understand, first of all, forms of work that do not meet the expectations and demands of those who perform them, and which, in light of these expectations, cause workers to suffer. Yet, in order to speak of pathologies of work here, one has to show that such forms of work are objectively pathological. That is, that the suffering that is subjectively experienced is caused by the institutional setting of work, by the conditions of labor. And there is a further criterion that needs to be developed, that these conditions contradict the intrinsic character of work. To speak of pathologies of work then is both to speak of individuals' subjective experience of suffering as a result of their work and of the objective conditions that contradict the demands and practical conditions of fulfillment associated with particular forms of work. And then again, to speak of individual suffering as a result of those objective conditions. The pathology of work thus refers to subjective suffering as a result of objectively bad work. And here, a socio-philosophical diagnosis of such pathologies needs to consider the normative characteristics of good work. This implies an account of the features that make work good work beyond the worker's own contentment. That is, in an objective sense, related to the task that is performed through work. But what then is work? If we are dealing here with pathologies of work as work, and not with the effects or the material reward that we get out of work, then it would seem sensible to seek to diagnose such pathologies on the basis of a conception of successful or meaningful or appropriate work. What is work then if it can be pathological? And in other words, what is successful work, or what are the normative implications of the concept of work? Is there a concept of work that could serve as a criterion for a socio-philosophical evaluation of working conditions? In setting out from the problems noted at the outset, we would seem, on the one hand, to already associate something quite definite with the resource that is work. It must then be possible to infer from the role, function, and value of work what its good and bad instantiations are, and thus what constitutes good or inadequate working conditions. This is at least what I have to assume in speaking of pathologies of work. On the other hand, however, we are confronted here with a well-known problem. Though we seem to assume that we have some sense of what work is when we speak of it, this confidence proves to be misplaced as soon as we attempt to define work as a specific form of activity by elaborating various characteristics of the activity as such. The German philosopher Friedrich Kambartel demonstrated this in his article entitled Arbeit and Praxis, in which he also undertook a necessary conceptual clarification with which I shall engage in what follows. Is work then to be conceived as a specific kind of activity? I first want to briefly run through a few more or less plausible candidates for such a definition, drawn from our everyday understanding of work. First, work is sometimes understood as a strenuous activity. Yet, having children is also strenuous, without thereby constituting work. Not every strenuous activity then counts as work. And inversely, some people seem to work without any physical effort, though we would not wish to deny that they are in fact working. Second, defining work as something that requires particular skills and qualifications does not take us much further. In order to play a Beethoven sonata or build a Star Wars Lego spaceship, one certainly has to have developed certain skills. But such activities cannot be straightforwardly understood as work, especially in cases where the pianist is a hobby musician and the Star Wars fan is a hobby engineer. Third, were we then to conceive work as instrumental or productive activity, someone making a table, for example, is working, we would fail to account for many activities that we are used to thinking of as work. In addition and inversely, not every such productive activity counts as work. On this conception then, academic work, educational work, service provision, and even plowing a field would not amount to work, whereas constructing a mobile with a fret saw wood. Fourth, even a broader conception of work as a purposeful, goal-oriented activity as opposed to a playful engagement with thoughts and things still fails to capture the specific character of work. You need only to observe the seriousness and the disciplined, planning-oriented attitude that children bring to their construction projects to question the wisdom of drawing the distinction along these lines. In other words, one can of course distinguish between goal-oriented and planned activities and unplanned and aimless activities. But this distinction cannot be mapped onto one we might make between the playful Lego builder and the working engineer. What we can take away from these failures now is that work cannot be individuated as a specific kind of activity over and against other activities, at least not in a way that could bring some order or lend plausibility to our everyday understanding of it, nor in a way that would allow us to easily draw any normative conclusions about good or desirable or even decent work. Now, there's an obvious alternative to such an activity-based definition. Perhaps our inquiry into the content of the concept of work should go by way of an inquiry into the role and function of work in society. That is, we should consider work as economic concept. The simplest and in our society most obvious approach here would be to define work as paid work. Everything for which one receives legitimate payment on the basis of contractually regulated relationship, everything then for which one receives a wage or salary, would then be work. The problem with such a conventional conception of work, however, is that it doesn't really tell us anything in terms of a normative stance. It only states that all those activities that have the possibility of being remunerated on the labor market count as work, while those that don't have this possibility do not count as work. From a normative perspective, this is an unsatisfying conventional definition, because it infers from the mere fact of a certain societal consensus, the legitimacy of this consensus, and from the actual state of working conditions, the conceptual content of work. This does not help us, however, if we are looking for normative criteria of what should count as work. If we wish to argue, for example, that household or care work, which thus far has not been recognized in society as work, should be regarded as such. A more sophisticated and broader version of the economic concept of work has been offered again by Kambartel, who proposed to define work in relation to the exchange of services within society. In societies marked by a division of labor, we exchange goods and services. For Kambartel, then, work can be defined as an activity performed for others in the context of the exchange of services within society. In contrast to the simpler economic criterion of work, this definition offers a normatively more robust, if more interpretatively challenging criterion for the determination of the right relationship between work and non-work. In a nutshell, from the fact that something constitutes a functional and integral element of the exchange of services in society, Kambartel derives the normative claim that it should be included in the sphere of paid work. By means of Kambartel's criterion, one can then say of certain activities that they are work if they have previously remained hidden and were performed for others in the context of the exchange of services within society. In feminist discussions, the expression shadow work has been coined to describe such activities. Nevertheless, the definition of work as an activity performed for others in the context of the exchange of services within society is still not sufficient for the diagnosis of pathologies of work. It serves to distinguish work from non-work and to bring to light the unfairness of excluding certain kinds of work, mainly work done by women, from public recognition. Yet it does not say anything about the quality of work. In order to draw a normative distinction between work as it should be in order to be good or non-pathological work, and work as it is in society, we need a concept of work that is neither essentialistic nor conventional, and that is able to take account of the quality of work. In the following, I shall attempt to combine my redescription of the new pathologies of work with a response to this challenge. My solution will be the following. If we define works in terms of sharing or partaking in the universal resources of society, this yields criteria for determining the nature of pathological work and a means of grasping the connection between different pathologies. My thesis here is that the meaning of work cannot be adequately explained as a specific kind of activity, nor with respect to its function within a social system of cooperation alone, but only in terms of the historically concrete instantiation of the resources of society. Work is a normatively charged concept, one in which normative expectations and the current form of a society's relation to work have become sedimented. Understood in this way, the concept of work does not simply refer to what a certain structure has become over time and currently is, nor to what we might arbitrarily read into it, nor to what an ahistorical anthropological definition takes it to be. Instead, it is necessary to understand work as a concept in which a particular problem and a corresponding task have crystallized over the course of time. I would now like to propose an interpretation of work that I have hinted at above. Work, in the sense we're looking for here, means sharing the universal resources of society. These universal resources, in German Vermögen, are to be understood here in line with the double meaning of the German term as both what a society has and what it is capable of doing. Work is thus a means of participating in society, not only in its wealth, in a continually growing economic surplus product, but also in the intersubjective recognition between its members and the knowledge and abilities that a certain society has developed over the course of its history. That means that it has historically bequeathed in the form of resources and competencies. If this is the meaning of work, then the pathologies of work discussed above can be understood as different ways of refusing or preventing participation in these universal resources. In the following, I shall elaborate a little on these claims by going back to Hegel's account, before considering how this analysis allows for an integrated interpretation of contemporary pathologies of work. In his Elements of the Philosophy of Right, Hegel conceives civil society as a work-oriented society. In doing so, he gives what is both a descriptive and a normative account of the dominant working conditions in such a work-oriented civil society, which runs as follows, I quote Hegel. In this dependence and reciprocity of work and the satisfaction of needs, subjective selfishness turns into a contribution towards the satisfaction of the needs of everyone else, so that each individual, in earning, producing, and enjoying on his own account, thereby earns and produces for the enjoyment of others. This necessity, which is inherent in the interlinked dependence of each on all, now appears to each individual in the form of universal and permanent resources, in which, through his education and skill, he has an opportunity to share. He is thereby assured of his livelihood, just as the universal resources are maintained and augmented by the income which he earns through his work. End of quote. With the notion of the interlinked dependence of each on all, Hegel is clearly taking up Adam Smith's description of the functioning of a society based on a market-led division of labor. Hegel, however, offers an ethical interpretation of this state of mutual interdependence. This necessity, which is at first a form of compulsion, a de facto interdependence, becomes a rational necessity, no longer simply a condition of the effective satisfaction of one's own interests. It becomes the condition of possibility of ethical cooperative relations in general, thus transcending the instrumental relation. If the individual has the opportunity through his education and skills, as he says, to share in the universal and permanent resources of society, then the necessity of participating in this universal market-mediated sphere becomes the possibility of participation qua qualification, qua Bildung, education, a possibility that would not be open to the individual outside of the cooperative social sphere. The individual would thus not be who they are if they did not go through this educational process that is mediated by society's universal resources. In order to take full stock of the content and interpretative force of this conception of work, I would now like to spell out what is implied by the idea of participating in the universal resources of society. We can first note that what seems to be meant here is both participating in and sharing in the universal resources of society. The individual who participates in the social sphere of work both does something, that is, he makes a contribution to the universal resources, and obtains or receives something. Through his work, the individual produces the universal resources of society and at the same time is also entitled to a part of them. This is then evidently a relation in which individuals reciprocally contribute to the satisfaction of their needs. The concept of resources, Vermögen again, introduced by Hegel here, also has a wide range of implications. On the one hand, resources are what a society has, that is, its material resources. Yet the term resources can also refer to what a society is capable of or what it can do, and thus to the knowledge and know-how and the mode of organization developed by a society over the course of its history. In this regard, the idea of the universal resources of society is tied to what in his philosophy of history Hegel calls the legacy of a society, that in which its historical achievements are contained. The universal resources of society are also the result of a developmental process, and in them the work of previous generations is stored. Sharing in the universal cooperative sphere of work thus also means sharing in this societal legacy. But what does Hegel mean by calling these the universal resources of society? These resources are universal not only because they are the result of a common effort on the part of all who are engaged in the cooperative working process, but also because what is achieved through this effort expresses the universal interest, insofar as the satisfaction of individuals' needs also secures the universal well-being. But they are also universal because the skills concerned both demand and transcend particularity. Education consists of working through or working off particularly, as he famously says. The universal resources are thus related to a particular form of cooperative activity. As a description of a social relationship, the expression participation in the universal resources draws attention to the fact that what is in question here is indeed a relationship between already liberated independent individuals and the universal. It is a relationship rather than a presupposed unity, and one that has to be actively maintained by the individuals involved. By working and contributing their capacities and skills, the latter must and can make themselves part of the universal sphere. On the other hand, however, this sphere only exists as the relationship between such free individuals. Work is thus not simply a cooperative relationship. In civil society, it is a cooperative relationship between emancipated, liberated, free beings that only arises as an ethical sphere through their cooperation. And this works the other way around too. The ethical dimension of work only arises because this cooperation is free. Finally, what the individual participates in through their education and skills is both something that already exists, a sphere that is mediated through the division of labor, and something that they co-produce and co-constitute through their participation in it. Their relation to it is then a relation of appropriation and constitution. One who participates in the universal sphere also helps to shape it, even where this formative power is lost or cannot be given full expression due to the role of certain social structures in the organization of work. Understanding work now as sharing of the universal resources of society is thus to understand it as a sharing in the complex of skills and capacities, including a certain mastery over nature, that humanity has acquired over the course of its history and in the associated social institutions that both rest and make these possible. There remains much to say about certain parallels with Marx's notion of the appropriation of and alienation from one's so-called species being. In concluding, however, I will limit myself to a brief discussion of the different forms of disturbance of participation in the universal resources of society, that is, social pathologies of work. In what way can participation in the universal resources of society be pathologically disturbed? And how might the notion of the universal resources of society help us to give an integrated interpretation of the above-mentioned pathologies, different forms or dimensions of the obstruction or disturbance of participation in the universal and permanent resources of society. The idea that work should be understood as such a participation should give us greater insight into the nature and quality of problematic working conditions, the manner in which these manifest themselves as precarious, alienating and exploitative dimensions of existing working conditions, and the way in which we might understand the connection between these pathologies as instances of a general pathology of work. Furthermore, it should provide us with resources to develop criteria for the critique of deficient working conditions. In other words, successful participation in societal resources and not simply self-realization through work is the paradigm on the basis of which pathological aberrations need to be thought. In closing, I would like to very briefly elaborate on this with regard to the above-mentioned pathologies. According to the thoughts I've developed above, one is excluded from the universal resources of society under the following working, or as the case may be, non-working conditions. First, unemployment clearly constitutes an exclusion from the universal resources of society, insofar as it prevents the individual from acquiring honor and livelihood through their participation in the cooperative social sphere. Yet, insofar as unemployment goes together with an inability to acquire or maintain skills, it does not constitute just any withdrawal of social recognition, nor one that could be compensated for in just any way, but it is also exclusion from the aggregate of a society's abilities. Second, underpayment is an aspect of the casualized labor market that prevents individuals from maintaining a livelihood through regular work, leading to a partial exclusion from honor and subsistence. Likewise, an existence determined by casualization and flexibility only allows one to share in a society's know-how, or in the honor that is procured through work to a limited extent. Here, the contingency of such sharing becomes apparent, a know-how risk becoming unspecific. Third, classical symptoms of alienation such as fragmentation and repetitive, impoverished or senseless activities also represent reduced or deficient participation in societal know-how. Furthermore, the absence of any scope for shaping these activities can be seen as a deficit where the appropriation of the universal resources is concerned. In sum, the pathological character of work is to be determined in relation to the achievements of the species or to what is necessary in order to be able to relate to the cooperative, ethical, work-mediated sphere. The different forms of preventing or making impossible this process of appropriating the universal resources constitute different pathologies. Whether these can not only be assessed on the basis of a common criterion, but also exhibit an internal connection to one another, is one of the many open questions that the approach outlined here will need to address. Thank you so much.